Welcome to the Cinematologists. I'm Dr. Dario Linares, and with me, as always, is Dr. Neil Fox. So, Neil, what's new this week?
What's new this week is the marking is done. So,
wow, joy.
The day job has sort of intruded on my film watching for the past few weeks. I always watch more TV. I think when I'm marking, end of a day, just watch a couple of episodes rather than anything, even if it's quite bad. But film wise, I've been going back into movies the last couple of days. I watched John Waters' Serial Mum again.
Okay.
Which
Never seen it.
You've never seen it? It's brilliant. It's a wonderful satire of media and celebrity and kind of the fascination with kind of real life criminals and crime, and beautifully played by Kathleen Turner as this kind of almost Lynchian extreme American housewife who whenever her family is slighted in the most kind of innocuous ways, decides that the obvious kind of retribution is to murder them horrifically, and it's wonderfully arch in that sense. But there's also, I think that Waters is having a lot of fun with kind of trying to put this film on screen where this kind of character does all these things and kind of gets away with them. There is a real mischief to it.
And Kathleen Turner as well. She was massive, wasn't she, in the 80s? I mean, it's just sort of. I know she sort of gets bit parts, very, very, very sort of parodic roles she seems to play on TV and stuff. You know, she was in Friends, wasn't she? And,
she kind of pops up all over the place.
Yeah.
And I saw her in The Graduate actually on stage.
Oh, of course, yes.
And she was fantastic in that.
Great.
But yeah, I mean that right at the end of that period of her kind of her height, the height of her fame as a movie star. So that was nice to revisit. And I'm very excited tonight. I've got Stray Dogs, Simon Ling's latest, which we've talked about a lot on the podcast, but that's here, so I'm going to watch that tonight.
Yeah, it's got kind of, again, up and down reviews, hasn't it, where it's those who are into that kind of slow cinema, thing, totally art house way of, I don't know, defining the world or representing the world in this particular kind of cinematic way are into it, and then, there are people who are just kind of like, they are bored to tears.
And it's interesting, because obviously the reaction seems to be, it was so revered on the festival circuit. Now it's kind of out in the cinema. There's almost this tendency, which I think happens a lot, where people say, "Oh, it's not that good." We've been waiting for a year to see this film, and as soon as it arrives, people who complain about the lack of diverse cinema in the multiplex or in kind of accessible channels are all saying, "Well, it's not that good." And it's just like, it seems odd that a film is so differently received. I think there's a lot to talk about there in terms of festivals and this kind of need for an instant response and proclamation of something's value, and then when it actually arrives in the general consent, in the general sort of consciousness, it's seen very differently.
Yeah, it's funny to hear a lot of the stories coming out of Cannes about particular films, and then you get maybe in a year later when they come out in the UK or however long it is. And there's always a sort of, well, this was what it was like at Cannes, and this is what I think about it now amongst critics. It seems to be, it's that thing about receiving a film or watching a film in a particular context definitely can influence what you think about that film, at a given point.
Very much so. I mean, I remember when we were on a film festival, we had Barry Norman, who programmed the season for us because he lived locally. And I remember his famous kind of story about the premiere at Cannes of the Da Vinci Code, which was famously, kind of booed. But he said that it was the reality was very much different. That all the critics left the cinema, and were sort of on the steps saying no one said anything. Right. They were waiting for the first person to say that was terrible, and then everyone went, "Oh, that was terrible." Yeah. No one wanted to be the first one to have a judgment on it, because then if people don't agree, or so I think it is really fascinating, that whole idea of where you stand and who's honest enough to say, "I really love this," or I really dislike this at the point of seeing it, rather than with sort of, and what was interesting this year about Cannes was the Lanthimos film The Lobster was the first time I've seen a film in ages where most of the reviews I read of it all said the same thing: I can't judge this film yet. I need to see it at least 3 more times because it's so odd and it's doing so many that people were very reluctant to say, is this good or bad, because it was so weird, I think. But that was kind of nice that critics were actually taking a step back and saying, it's not right to judge this film right now because we need to sit through,
And you could say that really about any film, in a sense. There's an immediate response, and then there's a considered response, and then there's a looking back in 10 years, and has this become a classic? Was it misjudged? It's all about context, I think, in analysing films, and that affects how they are taken.
Yeah, very much so.
As we've said. And you've also won an award this week, Neil.
I did.
Tell us a little bit about that, Mr. Innovation.
Mr. Innovation. I won an Innovative Teaching Award here at Falmouth University, and it was really lovely because it was nominated by the students. So the students put forward. It was at the Student Union Awards, and I'd been nominated by my level 2 screenwriters, I think, for innovative teaching. I'm not sure what I do that's innovative, but they seem to really like it. So.
But it's interesting. It's always nice to get some kind of recognition, even if it's something like formalized like that. But then when you're doing the teaching, and a student might say, "Oh, I really like that film," or what that piece of that literature we read, that article we read, really sort of made me think about this in a certain kind of way. And it doesn't happen an awful lot. I think that's most academics' experiences. The students come in, you do your thing, and then they leave. And so when you get those little moments of, there's a bit of recognition, just a simple point about, you introduced me to something, is always nice.
Wonderful, yeah. And it's great when it comes from the students, that sense, because that's kind of why we're here, that's why we're doing it, is to have that engagement and have that almost that dialogue, where we're kind of putting stuff out there and getting stuff back, and when it's recognised by the students, it does make you feel good. It was really nice, and it was very humbling to be there with students who nominated me, and very, very grateful for that. So. What about yourself? You've got some
I saw A Most Violent Year was the thing I kind of was looking forward to seeing for quite a long time, and never really got around to it. I think that it was a film that was sort of flagged up as by certain people as being a really great kind of in-depth drama, and it did play as a character piece, really. It was very sort of not thin on narrative, but a very sort of straightforward narrative setup. And it was very much about the interplay between Oscar Isaac and Jessica Chastain and their characters, and Oscar Isaac's trying to sort of go straight in this business that he's setting up, and his wife Jessica Chastain is got mob ties. She's the daughter of a famous mobster, so he's trying to go to the FBI and help them with their investigations about political corruption, everything like that, and they're investigating him. So it kind of plays around this sort of psychological development of this character who's trying to sort of not be drawn into this gangster lifestyle. And it's interesting because the title itself, A Most Violent Year, it kind of reminds you, just simply in the words itself, of a history of violence, which is a very violent film. This isn't a violent film at all, so it's kind of like missold in the title, but really, really in-depth, nice, intellectual film, I think. But again, if you're sitting down looking for a kind of gangster, violent gangster film like Goodfellas or something, it's not that kind of movie.
The way you're sort of talking about it reminds me of The Yard, the James Gray film, which is very much indebted to that slow 70s American cinema, characters in a specific milieu, kind of working things out, really. I really want to see that now.
Okay, so Neil, we're in this podcast, we're going to. This is the first of our summer sci-fi double bill, isn't it? It is. And we put together 4 recorded introductions to films that we screened last year as part of the BFI Sci-Fi season. So what was that? The BFI Sci-Fi season?
The BFI Sci-Fi season. It was called Days of Fear and Wonder, and it was a month-long kind of celebration of all things sci-fi in the movies, all types of sci-fi. The idea was to kind of have a central celebration. There was books released, big events in London at the BFI and around that. But also part of the remit of the BFI now is working much closer with regions. So the idea was that across the month, while there was things happening in London, there would also be screenings, event seasons, independent cinemas around, and sort of smaller kind of independent chains around the country. So we teamed up with our local art house independent cinema, the Poly, here in Falmouth.
Indeed.
And put on a little season. And the main thing we did was invited Mike Hodges down to screen Flash Gordon and talk about that.
Which is a really interesting evening.
It was a fantastic
evening. Talking about the joys of Flash Gordon, and for some, the liability that is Flash Gordon. Or for Hodges himself, he was kind of like, it was a bit, I don't know, it's a very sort of contradictory experience for him, wasn't it?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's definitely an anomaly in his films and the kind of films that he makes. Even The Terminal Man is a much different kind of sci-fi, and we'll probably talk more about that in terms of fantasy and sci-fi later on, and definitely in the second podcast. But yeah, I think it was he knew that the story and the kind of the concept was ludicrous and needed to be handled in a certain way, but a lot of the people involved didn't necessarily agree with it.
It was Shakespeare.
Exactly, yeah. So that was fun, and that was a big event. But we also programmed some films to introduce and kind of talk about. A colleague of ours did a double bill of THX 1138 and Primer.
Yeah, not for the faint-hearted.
No, that was an intense evening. You forget how bleak THX particularly is.
Doesn't offer a lot of ways in. Really, it's very distancing, that film. I find.
It is, and then you see Star Wars and see how much work Star Wars does to just make everything so explained and easy for you. Yeah. It really is. It's almost like it's made by a different filmmaker. Yeah. And so our colleague Kingsley introduced that double bill. We introduced sort of 2 individual screenings, and on Halloween we did a kind of sci-fi horror double bill.
Okay, so that's what we're going to talk about first. So the first 2 films that we intro, Neil started off with The Fly. And I introduced Demon Seed. So Neil, why did you choose The Fly?
Because it's brilliant, isn't it? I mean,
it is. It is good.
If you're looking for a sci-fi horror, I don't think there's many better examples. And we use that rationale a lot, isn't it? Things that we like talking about, but also kind of films that you hope inspire a conversation, and particularly those 2 films did inspire sort of conversations. Yeah,
it's part of that whole subcategory, if we call it that, of sci-fi horror. Both of those films sort of drew out themes about the way in which technology can present these potential harmful effects for society as a whole, but really for the kind of interfering with the human condition, what it means to be human. On a fundamental level, and both of the films sort of drew that out, didn't they?
They do, and both films kind of have this central male protagonist who, almost in that Icarus way, is looking to be responsible for the furthering of what is possible, right. And that ego kind of takes over in both cases and leads to, obviously, as is common in these kind of films, complete chaos and disorder.
Yeah, and there's some with The Fly as well. I think that there is some really kind of interesting topics around masculinity, particularly the character of Jeff Goldblum, and you have this sort of sense of control and then reproduction, and again that's kind of comes out in Demon Seed very strongly again about that idea of male scientists kind of controlling, the nature, and then that in terms of narrative that gets put onto one woman, and both the narrative of the discourse of reproduction is very central to those films. Yeah,
because obviously in The Fly she becomes pregnant, and what's really interesting that these men have a discussion about her body and what she should do with it while she's in the room. Yeah. It's so kind of on the money in terms of the politics of of gender and abortion. Even now it feels very, but she's a very kind of specific, kind of determined character in a different way to Julie Christie's character in Demon Seed, which is, I think, a much more complex portrayal of a woman in that situation.
Yeah, it is. I mean, it's a really interesting film because it was made in the same year as Star Wars, but the production values are completely different, let's say. I think, you've got to credit Star Wars in terms of special effects, as being a game changer in that sense. And Demon Seed really looks dated in terms of its production values.
But it has so many more ideas going
exactly.
on.
Yeah, for sure.
And I think we'll talk about what is sci-fi. Yeah. What do we like about it? What do we think it should be, and what was it best at? And you like to torment your students, didn't you?
Yeah, I did. I mean, it's always an interesting one where you pull out a film and you put it on that is going to not fit in with their idea. If they're raised on a sort of diet of Transformers and Avengers and CGI and a particular kind of presentation of the world from very much a kind of fantasy perspective, and then when you've got clunky machines, sort of one-armed wheelchairs wandering around the set, then it does look kind of weird. But that fundamental notion of artificial intelligence, man creating an artificial being who then decides that his own creator is doing things wrong and has to be changed, is a really interesting theme. I think that runs through a lot of sci-fi.
Yeah, and that it's in that idea is in the most recent Avengers film. But what is interesting in terms of just what you were saying there is a lot of the things that Demon Seed talks about are present in other films, but not necessarily as consciously. So critics or particular critics from particular sort of disciplines, feminism or race, pick out things that the film is saying, but not necessarily consciously on the part of the filmmakers. Yeah. What Demon Seed is doing is it knows knows it's being problematic, and it's both having fun with it, but also being very, very kind of interested in what these questions are and what we're and our role in it as kind of humans and with technology. So it's a fascinating film. It really is.
Okay, so let's listen to our introductions to The Fly and Demon Seed.
Welcome to this very special Halloween double bill screening of The Fly and Demon Seed. It's not a lot of people, but everyone here seems to be really excited, and that's the main thing. Bill Cosby always said that you don't perform to the people who don't show up; you perform to the people who do. So I've done a PowerPoint. Dario's done a PowerPoint, and I've written a kind of introduction. So we're going to do it as if it's a full house, and it's really nice to see people coming out and excited to see these films, which. We both love sort of collectively and individually we're really kind of excited to talk about this stuff. So let's crack on. So I'm going to talk about The Fly very, very shortly before we watch it, just to kind of give a bit of context, kind of from my point of view about it. There are a few maybe kind of spoilers, but I try not to kind of give too much plot away, but I do touch on things that the film is about and things that might happen. So if you haven't seen it, I apologise, but I don't ruin anything, and I don't give away any of the big kind of twist. I'm sure that it's a horror sci-fi called The Fly. I'm sure you know, or you can kind of guess where it goes. Okay, so the main thing is that real scientists don't look like Jeff Goldblum. Okay, and that's no offense to scientists, of course. When we think of scientists, we think of them looking like this. I think that's kind of fair. Scientists in our imagination and in our society don't really look like this. Also, when we think of scientists, we don't think of them living in a really cool kind of post-Rudy Giuliani gentrified New York loft. And yet, in The Fly, Seth Brundle lives in this ridiculous place, the hippest place in town. It's like this veritable Chelsea swank pad where he perches at his computer terminal barefoot and is lit and framed like a concert pianist giving a recital. And let's be fairer to real scientists. Hardly anyone looks like Jeff Goldblum in the world, and fewer still exude his pure sexual power. Jeff Goldblum is in the 1%. He's in the unattainable, he's the godlike. And then when we think of it like that, that's when it clicks. The Fly isn't really a film about science, it's about something else. It's about that 1%. It's a film about power. It's a film about arrogance, ego, rampant male threat, and alpha dominance, and sex, of course. And the whole first sequence of the film drips in that kind of sexual power. Seth Brundle's opening gambit is that his discovery is something that will change the world as we know it. He dismisses all the other scientists at the soiree where he picks up Gina Davis. He's magnetic. He's bravura. He is no lab rat. And little does he know, though, that Gina Davis gives as good as she gets, and some more on that later. They leave this gathering, and that's when we see his ridiculous, minimalist artisan bachelor pad. And there follows this wonderfully seductive standoff where Ronnie, Gina Davis's character, matches his sexual confidence as she removes her stocking for his experiment. They really, really want to get in each other's pants at this point. But both from the outset are ruthless careerists. They're determined to make their name and find their fame. And the film waits. It's called The Fly, but Cronenberg doesn't rush us to the gore or this kind of story point. It's a full third of the film before the fateful trip through deconstructed and reconstructed space and time occurs. And this is deliberate. This is so we really know what the film is about. And then when it happens, when Brundle steps out of this pod, defiant, he does it at speed, and he's greeted by his primate companion who just kind of leaps into his naked arms. And we think, is this a scientist, really? Look at him. I mean, just look at him. That is not a scientist. What it is man in all its glory. and it's madness. And Seth is convinced of his own genius. He's in love with himself. He's in love with Gina Davis. He feels worshipped. But the contemplation that she has her own life, a life that isn't Brundle-centric, sends him into a fit of drunken jealousy that results in his ego overriding his exactness. Laziness caused by lustful anger is his downfall. The Fly is about man's quest for power. It's an Icarus fable, it's power over nature, it's power over women, it's primal masculine power. It's a quest that may come at the cost of everything sane and human and expose the ugliness of man. Brundle as man risks becoming dehumanized. Post-pod trip, he glistens, he shows his physical and sexual prowess, he rages at the woman who loves him, never ever entertaining the thought that the subsequent changes inside of him could be negative. He prowls for sex, he gets in silverback duels in dive bars, he grows convinced that he is becoming a light and powerful, perfect creature. Asked by a woman he picks up in a bar to sate his insatiable lust if he is a magician, he replies, yes. He leaves the realm of reason, of rationality, and yes, science behind, and disappears up his own microscope, believing he is becoming godlike. But he's becoming a bug. He's becoming a parasite. He can't see this or won't admit it. Blinded by his own arrogance, he starts down the road to ruin. Then when it finally clicks, his first response is the ultimate in self-involved self-pity. Am I dying? From the heavens to the grave in an excruciating mirror examination. When he's beyond the point of return, he strikes for profundity, but like most privileged white men who become consumed by power to where they become utterly dehumanized and destroy everything good that is in their orbit, he completely misses the point. He says, insects don't have politics. They are very brutal. No compassion, no compromise. We can't trust the insect. I'd like to become the first insect politician. Whatever that last line means. And then you go, oh man, Brundlefly, Mr. 1%, Mr. ridiculously hot scientist who lives in a ludicrous loft apartment. Really? Insects are like that? Well, maybe they are, but insects are under no illusion of their nature. Unlike you, who cannot see that man is brutal, lacks compassion, lacks compromise, and here's the kisser, we already have politics, and none of that matters. Brundlefly claims he knows he is an insect who dreamed he was a man and loved it, but now the insect is awake. Well, I hate to break it to you, dude, but insects don't dream. And if they did, it's unlikely they dream of being men. Well, maybe they dream of being Jeff Goldblum, because I think we've all had that dream. And if this fable isn't bleak enough for you, and you think it's old-fashioned, the final moments feature a Cronenbergian teleportation to 2014 and a kick up the jackseat of the jaded iPhone generation, which I won't spoil. And then throughout all of this, there's Ronnie, played by Gina Davis, who has to fight two white men for the right to remove Brundlefly's mutant fetus from her womb. Well, the two white men surely know what's best for her. She is repeatedly harassed and patronised by her lecherous editor and frankly stalker of an ex-boyfriend, even before Brundlefly turns onto her and starts his transformation. She rages at the horrid Stathis Borans, which, yes, sounds a lot like the egomaniacal and psychopathic Stannis Baratheon from the Game of Thrones. And she has to scream at him, I don't care what you want, in reference to her own life. She is not weak, she doesn't roll over, she stands up for herself. She defends her career and her right to be a sexual individual. She's angry, determined, compassionate. So we know that she's not an insect. And her connection to Seth/Brundlefly feels honest and real. These are interesting insertions of feminism into a sad, tragic satire on the sheer hilarious arrogance of man. And some of the film is very, very funny. And like all good horror movies, it's horrific because it reminds us what and who monsters really are. And like all good sci-fi movies, it shows us visions of what is coming for humanity emotionally, spiritually, socially, through the prism of the failures and ignorance of both the past and the present. And I hope you enjoy them.
Well, thank you for staying, everybody. How good was that, by the way? Sorry, Neil, but I still prefer Gina Davis. But each to their own. Okay. So the second part of this double bill is, of course, Demon Seed, directed by Donald Cammell and starring the wonderful Julie Christie. I first showed this film on a course I teach about postmodernism a couple of years ago, and it had kind of a polemic effect on the students. half of them thought it was a really sort of satirical and interesting and profound allegorical take on technology and its effect on the human condition. And the other half thought it was a load of old bollocks. So it's interesting to see where you are on that kind of spectrum. But the film encapsulates for me everything that I like about 70s sci-fi. Its production values are at best dated, at worst they're laughable. But it tells you as much about the 1970s as it does about any futurist prognostication, I think. But the film also explores real fundamental philosophical questions about the human condition, about existentialism, and the role of technology in our future evolution. And in many ways, the themes of the film are prescient today as they were at the time. So, Demon Seed was released in 1977, 3 months before Star Wars. And I always enjoy winding up my students by saying that this is a far superior film. Now, in a sense, those two films, Demon Seed and Star Wars, they represent a kind of two parallel strands, perhaps, of hard sci-fi and soft sci-fi. One concerned with action and fantasy and spectacle, and the other more concerned with grander philosophical ideas and questions. And indeed, you could argue that 1977 itself is a kind of shift. So we have the beginning of the blockbuster, and you have Close Encounters of the Third Kind and Superman are all coming out around that time. So suddenly films like Demon Seed, Westworld, Silent Running, Rollerball, Soylent Green, Logan's Run, all of these films, all made in the preceding 7 years, overnight began to look dated straight away. But the strength of these films, and Demon Seed included, remains their allegorical prescience. It's fascinating for that reason, and it's full of kind of wacky 70s versions of the technology that we're all used to seeing today. So a little bit like The Fly, Demon Seed is centrally about science going wrong, which of course is a staple of the sci-fi genre as a whole. And Demon Seed is specifically about the arrival of artificial intelligence, the invention of computers that are so clever, their first realization is to realize that humans are a little bit shit, and they need to be controlled for their own good. So Demon Seed has one of the classical dystopian supercomputers, and it's called Proteus 4. Now, you might think of the iconic AI machines that have spanned history. So you might think of HAL 9000, for example. You might also think of Skynet. And you could possibly also think of Windows 8, the terrifying software programs that control our lives on a day-to-day basis, I think. So, where was I? So the film foregrounds a kind of contemporary, it foregrounds the notion of technology and what its influence is on what our daily lives could be. And it anticipates the moment in which scientists have called the singularity. Now, the singularity is when scientific progress reaches a point that humans can no longer fully understand it or control it. And in science fiction, it's often symbolized by the invention of a self-actualized computer intelligence, something that has its own mind. And at this point, humans become obsolete. Now, futurist writer Ray Kurzweil predicts that this is going to happen in 2045. I'll be 71 at that point, so if a computer wants to vacuum out my brain, I don't think I'll have much to say about it. But the other way the film foregrounds contemporary technology is related to what is called the Internet of Things. Okay, so this is the notion that all technology is becoming embedded with internet connectivity. So all of the technological inventions and appliances that you use will increasingly be networked to an overall central computer. So this will allow computers to talk to each other and precipitate a kind of revolution in automation, you could argue. So, sensors in your bed would realize that you're about to wake up and start to heat the waters in your shower. After scanning vital signs, breakfast would be made according to the exact physiological requirements of your body. The engine of your car would be pre-warmed for maximum efficiency. The phone and computer data would structure your timetable automatically. Your driverless car would be hooked into every other car on the road, so traffic jams would become a thing of the past, and you would find a parking space automatically. So a utopia of efficiency, you might think. But in Demon Seed, the potential dystopian nightmare is revealed if an intelligent computer starts to use such networking technology to control you. So after seeing this, you might think twice about hooking your toaster up to the internet.
So finally, Demon Seed is also a film about sex, as we've seen with The Fly. Sex and power, and the power of reproduction. It seems there's a lot of sci-fi that's kind of about that. And there's very much a line of feminist psychoanalysis. It postulates that the male proclivities towards aggression, competitiveness, discovery, invention, this derives from the fact that they can't have babies. So this reproductive anxiety is a key trope in science fiction, all the way back to Frankenstein, for example. Men can't reproduce, so they employ dodgy scientific practices to create new life forms for themselves, eventually unleashing monsters. So this is a key strand in the film that is quite unnerving. So I have to warn you as well, there are some sexual violence scenes in the film. And it's also been criticised the film's been criticised as just another kind of rape fantasy. But Demon Seed could also be interpreted as a warning against science's encroachment onto the boundaries of human creation. And alongside that, it boasts a psychotic one-armed wheelchair and computerized orgasms. What else could you want from the film? So I give you the sloptastic 1970s brilliance, Demon Seed.
So Neil, what struck you about rewatching those two films on the big screen on the night?
A couple of things. The first thing is I think The Fly stands up better aesthetically and in terms of it's aged better visually than Demon Seed. But what did strike me was how similar some of the concerns between the two films are, particularly around this idea of men and science and the kind of almost the loss of control and the kind of when ego takes over. And when ego takes over, interestingly in Demon Seed, it takes over in the male machine. Kind of gets an ego that's akin to its creator, which I think is really interesting.
And Demon Seed really does sort of for the audience, I think, who hadn't seen it before, because the production values are not not that strong, relatively if you're looking back. But then it takes a real turn halfway through and becomes really sort of, violent. And, there is sort of scenes of sexual violence. It doesn't become graphic, but it does that thing where it leaves things to the imagination. Yeah. And, there's that very famous kind of sort of abstract moment where you're envisaging that the machine is having sex with Julie Christie. I mean, you don't see anything. It's almost a sort of surrealist moment in the middle of this sci-fi.
I think, and it's when you realise as an audience what the film is saying and how it's saying it, that's when all that stuff about the production value and the kind of the campness kind of goes out the window, because you realise actually this is some really dark territory that the film is going into, and Christie's very convincing. So it carries you along, and it's similar to The Fly in the sense that Jeff Goldblum struts around like a peacock with his shirt off, and no shoes and socks. Kind of, seducing Gina Davis.
He's perfectly cast in that.
It's incredible.
Unbelievably good performance by Jeff Goldblum.
And you kind of ignore the ludicrousness of it because he's so charismatic. But also really, once he becomes Brundlefly, increasingly there is a real desperation and real vulnerability to him. And he's an incredible actor. But that film also then shifts into this very dark territory, and when you again realise what's being said and the implications of the first half of the film are being realised.
It's interesting to me because it perhaps leads into this discussion about how we define sci-fi, and whether sometimes when what we call sci-fi is actually fantasy. Because it's interesting, in a way, The Fly starts off as what you might call hard sci-fi and then moves more into fantasy, whereas Demon Seed, even though it's kind of got its ridiculousness, it really is a sort of foretelling of computerized systems to come. Even the idea of the Internet of Things with the computer controlling every piece of equipment in the house in order to maintain Julie Christie in this sort of prison, this electronic prison, as it were. So it leads into this sort of this understanding or this definition, let's say, which, if you're into sci-fi, I mean, I know I've discussed quite a lot in the past as sci-fi that I would call actually interested in scientific and philosophical ideas, and then sci-fi simply is spectacle and fantasy and entertainment.
Stuff that's just set in space because it's a cool, interesting place to. I mean, is is that kind of a definition you think holds up, or is that just something that you believe in? I guess. So.
Well, I do think that there is a difference. There are two kinds of sci-fi, and don't get me wrong, these lines are blurring all the time. But I mean, if you go to, I mean, just in the way that I teach, for example, if we're bringing up kind of like issues of what you would consider as the scientific canon or the sci-fi canon, you make that distinction maybe between Star Wars and 2001 as two films that are absolute benchmarks, but in completely different ways.
Yeah.
And how do they relate to the notion of sci-fi? And then you get recent films which we both liked, things like Under the Skin and Her, which then move off into this kind of much more philosophical, much more of a foretaste of what might become, trying to make a comment on the future and the now. And then you compare those to films, maybe like the Avengers films or Oblivion, or the one with the repetition one with Tom Cruise, Edge of Tomorrow, which we both liked. We thought it was great fun. But again, that is a fantasy spectacle, enjoyable film, which perhaps doesn't have this kind of allegorical aim.
Yeah, and I think also once you start, I mean, to look at the logic of Edge of Tomorrow, even within its own world, would probably just instantly would fall apart under the weight of that. So a lot of these films are not open to a kind of even basic level of scientific scrutiny. So what's interesting about Interstellar is that I enjoyed Interstellar as a yarn, as a kind of space yarn with Matthew McConaughey as this kind of cowboy. I enjoyed it, but when the film was trying to move into that 2001 territory, I just felt it completely fell apart, and it just didn't convince me.
No, absolutely right. And I have this thing where, and again, we're probably going to talk about this in the next podcast a little bit, this idea of a film being logical within its own terms, setting up its own rules and then adhering to them. And leaving the audience to kind of have that distance to make the gap of things that are unexplained. But then when you get a film like Interstellar, which I think is its problem, when it tries to explain everything, that's when the massive holes start to appear. And I don't really care how scientifically accurate Interstellar is. Its characters behave ridiculously. Yeah. So that's why it falls apart.
Exactly. And then you kind of question everything around it. Yeah. Things that you wouldn't normally do. There was an interesting interview yesterday because this kind of lost Star Wars legacy thing. I don't know. It's called Lost Night or Dark Night or something like that. It was a short film that was released with Empire Strikes Back. They're kind of making it now. It's like released as a trailer. But it was interesting because the guy who made that film is now making the feature, and he was saying that he was going for the realism of Alien and Star Wars, and I thought that's a really interesting word to use in terms of realism, because I don't think there's anything realistic about Star Wars, and but Alien has a feeling which is closer to to not reality, but
you can envisage it being a future directly descended from where we are in the real world here.
Exactly, and Star Wars there's just no way. No. And I think what's interesting is because Star Wars, particularly those first films, are dirty.
Yeah.
It's kind of that's real. It's kind of almost in that kind of post-apocalyptic way where everything's broken.
But the caveat is at the beginning of Star Wars, in a long time ago in a galaxy far, far away. That statement in itself separates it from any kind of potential grounding in our own realist universe, let's say, and therefore that's the reason it works. It allows George Lucas to then go off and have the Force and Darth Vader and all the carry on.
Whereas Alien feels very much kind of it's interested in those kind of ideas that are kind of core to a lot of the sci-fi that we love. Those serious questions of the other. Yeah, that's right. And sort of this. Also, the role of what I like about Alien, is the role of just everyday people in the other, and the way that society and particularly corporate society is kind of.
And then you get great examples which are very clever. Like, I mean, again, I think we both love this film Under the Skin recently, which it uses the sci-fi genre to kind of explore issues of identity and issues of place and being and what it means to be human. But then uses that kind of device again, which has been used before, as an alien coming down and trying to figure out what human beings are, and then and leaving, unlike Interstellar, leaving an awful lot unexplained, and therefore bringing or making the viewer try to work to understand what is going on here, and doing it beautifully at the same time.
With drama, with a real cinematic kind of sense about it. And I know that's kind of personally what I love about sci-fi is, the kind of sci-fi that we're talking about is that recognition of the now, but the distance that you sometimes need to understand the politics and of now. And great sci-fi does it. I mean, it's completely, different route. But I've just finished watching Third Rock from the Sun.
Okay, good segue there. Yeah,
to go into a completely different tangent. But what it does in 2 or 3 seasons really, really well is it asks those direct questions about how we live now, what's going on now, from the perspective of an alien in that context. How does an alien see it? How would an alien interpret what we do? And it really flags up. There's some great episodes on race, on gender. There's a brilliant one on patriotism and the idea of being an American, which is absolutely really smart. But having that distance of the alien, the sci-fi, kind of makes it entertaining, interesting visually, but also gives that distance where you can really engage with those ideas without the kind of the baggage, I guess, of the everyday.
Sure. And the other thing that sci-fi does, and we'll probably just use this to go into our next 2 introductions to The Thing and Rollerball. So we'll probably talk about this after the intros. But sci-fi is a social allegory, as a kind of exploration or comment upon what is going on at this moment in time, politically, socially, culturally. I mean, that's a fundamental theme that sci-fi works with, doesn't it?
And it does. And I think those are 2 examples where it does it in really, really great ways that are entertaining. And I think that's a lot of the films we're talking about are, really entertaining movies, but with something to say about the. And what's interesting is both those we screened both those films. We'll probably talk about this as well. And they're old movies, but they still feel very, very relevant to, to kind of fundamental issues in society.
Sure. So let's listen to our intros to The Thing and Rollerball.
Okay, good evening. Welcome to the Poly. My name's Dr. Neil Fox from the School of Film and Television at Falmouth University. And I'll be introducing John Carpenter's The Thing as part of the BFI Sci-Fi season, Days of Fear and Wonder. After the screening, we're going to be in the bar if people want to chat about the film and sort of have a conversation about it. If you haven't seen it, if you have seen it, things you like, that kind of thing. I'm recording the introduction and the conversation to post online. So if you do want to kind of get involved in the conversation, then please join us afterwards. The introduction won't take long. And I'll just kind of cover some of the things I think about the film, but also kind of this kind of sci-fi movie in a wider context. So, I was raised Catholic. And amongst the kind of plethora of reasons that my faith in the church dwindled as I grew up was this idea that this was it. That the earth was the single expression of God's plan for sentience and advanced consciousness, and that in an infinite universe, we were alone. And I thought that even if the existence of God as taught by the Catholic Church proved true, the idea that we were alone in an infinite universe, that this was the only space where conscious beings existed and developed, was not only absurd, but arrogant, and worryingly arrogant at that. So I wrestled with this idea of there being other things out there in the universe and what they might be like. As an aside, I've always wanted to make a sci-fi movie where either kind of people from Earth come across, or we are visited by people who are wearing exactly the same clothes as us at that time. I don't understand why all other races have this kind of single silver spacesuit. That's not my joke. That's a Jerry Seinfeld joke. He delivers it much better. Because why would they be different? Why are we so arrogant to think that this is us and everyone else must be different? We don't all wear the same thing now, do we? Despite how homogenized, uniform, and children of the corn like old people say that young people dress. We have variety in our lives. Why wouldn't aliens have variety in theirs? So The Thing was released in 1982 at the height of an intelligent, adult-driven sci-fi boom that includes, to list a few films from this 10-year period of between 76 and 86, Close Encounters of the Third Kind, Alien, the very best Star Wars movie, The Empire Strikes Back, Star Trek II, The Wrath of Khan, Blade Runner, E.T., The Terminator, and of course, maybe the jewel the jewel in the crown of that entire period, the pinnacle of maybe sci-fi as a genre, Howard the Duck. In America, The Thing was released 2 weeks after E.T., and director John Carpenter has said that E.T. was the sweet and The Thing was the mean. I think he missed a trick not saying it was the sour, but there you go. But both films are two answers to the same question. Not are we alone, but what are the others like? And The Thing has this idea that an alien force will be aggressive and hostile. And this has always appealed to me, this idea that when we're visited, it's going to be with anger. Now, don't get me wrong, I'm a huge E.T. fan. E.T. was the first film that I saw at the cinema, and I still remember that feeling, that experience. I remember the darkness, I remember the huge image on the screen. I mostly remember being on the bus with my dad, and I was in my dressing gown and wellies, and that he was carrying my slippers in a carrier bag. But the idea that if we meet other life forms, other conscious species, they will want to conquer us, destroy us, control us, is really scary, not due to the fact that it's possible, but because it's likely. And it's likely for this reason. Because the standard movie world presentation of humanity is usually quite humble and quite modest. But what it fails to realize is that conquering other places is exactly what we would do if we could. Because it's exactly what we do here on this planet on a daily basis. The power base in our civilization routinely destroys other people's and other cultures to sate and further its own greed and power. It's human nature. And you can call it Darwinism, or you can call it survival of the fittest if you like, but it also applies to any kind of notions of God. Regardless of opinion, scientific or religious, whatever's led us to this point in our civilization, we have free will to a point as a species. And some of our species take it upon themselves to control the fate, directly or indirectly, of other less, shall we say, resourceful members of the species. So let's take this point to its logical end. If God also created other species in an infinite universe, surely those who head out from their indigenous base to explore what the universe has to offer might entertain the notion of colonizing what and who they find. It's what humans have done on this planet for centuries. It makes sense that this might be the agenda of galactic conquistadors. Some of the best sci-fi movies offer this possibility, but many present human beings as morally, ethically superior and aloof from the notion that they would rape and pillage and murder other planets given the chance. In most sci-fi movies, the logic that I present here is often rejected in favour of a humble victim mentality on the part of humanity as it is visited and threatened. And this rings as false to me as some of the sermons I heard in church growing up. My favourite example of a welcoming president in a sci-fi invasion movie is Jack Nicholson's president in Tim Burton's Mars Attacks, who goes from why can't we all get along to nuke them in the beat of a heart. And that feels real, from ignorance and naivety to a righteous fury in a single skip. And make no mistake, The Thing is an invasion movie, and it's our world in microcosm. It's our world splayed out under a microscope. What's interesting about it is that both Carpenter and Kurt Russell have described it as a film about paranoia. But it doesn't just hark back to Cold War paranoia films of the 50s and 60s. It channels its own contemporary moment. The rise of Reaganomics, the imminent threat of Star Wars, not the terrible sequels, but the nuclear annihilation. Maybe the same thing. Carpenter and Russell, in a brilliant commentary for the film, discuss how the film is aware of AIDS, something that at the time of production was a rumbling, a whisper, but would soon become world news and subsequently mythologized by predominantly right-wing media as a global destroyer, a disease where nobody knew who had it, nobody knew how you got it, nobody knew how it was transmitted, and nobody knew how to cure it. And that sounds very familiar if you've seen The Thing. Who's infected? How do they get infected? And how do we stop it? It's a sublime commentary on presentations of communism and AIDS, but it presents people on the end of a vicious invasion by an alien beast in realistic terms. There's very little moralizing or sanctimony. It's about survival. It's about trust and how you respond to people you think you know when a threat comes down. It's bleak. The lack of trust in it is absolute. And this is what marks it out for me. It feels real. It's a fucked up situation, and we live in a fucked up world. It's every man for himself. Look around you, it's mostly, sadly, the world that we live in now. The film carries the weight of all these ideas lightly because it's basically a badass action movie. It's a simple idea presented in a perfect location. It's got a great cast. It's got an amazing and still solidly respectable special effects element to it. It's got a brilliant Ennio Morricone score and a never better, never cooler, never more kick-ass and divinely bearded Kurt Russell, the kind of man who makes you think maybe there is a God. And it has one of the most wonderfully subtle and ambiguous movie endings of all time. Are they still human? Are they the thing? The paranoia that runs through the film is absolute beyond the closing credits. So to close, and to bring it back full circle, do I believe in God? No. Do I believe in the church? No. Do I believe that we are alone in the universe? No. Do I believe if anyone arrives here, they will come locked and loaded for a takeover? Of course, if they are anything like human beings. But do I have faith? Well, hell yes, I do. I have faith in people, in humanity, and in its equivalent across space and time. And the thing shows us humanity at its worst, but also at its rawest and most primal, at its most scared and defensive. And the beauty of sci-fi is that it can also remind us through its very nature that other ideas are possible. So I believe in people, or rather conscious beings, in case any out there are listening to it on SoundCloud. I believe that ultimately we will trust each other and help each other, and we won't destroy each other. Because what else is there to believe? It is bleak, and it's a really bleak movie. But the other options are too silly and too scarier, much sillier and much scarier than anything presented in the movie, which I hope you enjoy.
Good evening, everybody. Welcome to the next instalment of Days of Fear and Wonder. Small but very perfectly formed audience with excellent taste, I think. So tonight's screening is Rollerball, of course. I'm going to give a very quick intro and then we'll be straight into the film. So Rollerball, I think, is firmly rooted in the 1970s, and it tells us as much about that period as it does about the future. In fact, it's part sci-fi, part conspiracy film, part sports movie, and part social allegory. It's a classic example of one of the key strands of sci-fi, I think, and that's the foretelling of a dystopian future. But it's ironic and satirical in that it's a future in which all social ills have been taken care of. There's no war, no famine, no poverty, but the price for this is obedience. Liberty is sacrificed for an overarching power of a corporate elite. Therefore, the question that underpins the film is it better to be free or better to be comfortable and entertained? Now, Rollerball was directed by Norman Jewison, whose contribution to film history should be reassessed, I think. In fact, I think that's what you should all do for your homework, go and reassess Norman Jewison's oeuvre. He's a kind of forgotten voice in the pantheon of classic filmmakers. Maybe it's because he's Canadian rather than American. And he's made seminal films over 4 decades. His work often has a social conscience to it. He's a director that takes difficult subject matter and makes it accessible for a mainstream audience. Now, Rollerball came in 1975, just after Fiddler on the Roof and Jesus Christ Superstar. So you could say it's a kind of shifting gear, but it still uses cinema as a tool for allegorical storytelling. Now, the screenplay for Rollerball was adapted by William Harrison from his own short story called Rollerball Murder, which is a short story published in Esquire magazine in 1973. Now, the prescience of the film is that, unlike many sci-fi movies, in which governments exact totalitarian rule over the masses with surveillance and the military, Rollerball envisages a world in which corporations have taken over a global decision-making process, and the masses are distracted by this barbaric gladiatorial spectator sport. So essentially, it could be a hard-hitting social realist documentary, really. The violence is a key aspect to the film, and it might seem tame by today's standards, but it's a comment on the violent nature of both society and men. Rollerball's future, peace has broken out. Yes, it sounds like a nightmare. But Jewison himself comments here on the sport that provides an avenue for our violent desires. It harks back to the Roman Colosseum, the brutality and spectacle combined in a socially sanctioned substitute for warfare. That was a mouthful. The players are gods, and they are revered and worshipped. But the sport is supposed to demonstrate the powerlessness of the individual and the strength of the collective. Its political philosophy refers back to Plato's Republic. In this context, sport has a specific social function. It's a method of keeping the masses distracted and entertained by an elaborately organised yet fundamentally meaningless competitive spectacle. We don't tend to think of sport in such terms, but think how much people invest in their sporting teams. Disease, poverty, climate change, these things don't concern us. What concerns us is who scored the hat-trick on a Sunday afternoon. Just think of the social unrest if the Premier League was suddenly cancelled. Locations add a sense of facelessness of the corporation that controls everything. The Rollerball Stadium is set in the vast circular Rudi Seidemeier Hall in Munich, a venue which was basketball venue which was built for the 1972 Olympic Games. Also in Munich, you'll find the cylindrical towers of the Energy Corporation HQ, which is the BMW building. In the film, each city represents a facet of social organisation. So Houston is the energy city, and there's cities for transportation, housing, food, leisure, etc. So this is a very simple idea that works perfectly, and unlike Christopher Nolan films, doesn't require pages of Basil exposition. The World Library, where Jonathan consults the supercomputer Zero, is in the League of Nations building in Geneva. And another aspect of the film is that information is controlled. Knowledge means power. It's different to usual depictions of supercomputers which are intent on destroying humanity. Instead, it takes knowledge and information away. Jonathan encounters a classic moment of computer says no, another foreshadowing of a future where we spend too much time having to deal with inept operating systems. The film, of course, stars James Caan. Now, first of all, what's going on with James Caan's hair? That's what I want to know. Far be it from someone as follically challenged as I am to criticise someone's hair, but it's a testament to the 1970s that someone who looks like this can become a major Hollywood star. And he's had some great roles, most famously Sonny in The Godfather, but you can also see him in Honeymoon in Vegas with Nicolas Cage. He gets his ankles crushed by Kathy Bates in Misery and tries to teach Hugh Grant to become a teamster in Mickey Blue Eyes. His character, Jonathan E., represents the symbolic power of the masses that could be the key to breaking down the entire system. I'd rather follow James Caan into revolutionary battle than Russell Brand any day of the week. One of the brilliant aspects of the film is the depiction of a sport that doesn't actually exist. The criticism of sports movies is that they can never authentically represent the sporting action, but the game sequences in the film still stand up in making you believe in the veracity of this future sport. The circular design of the arena lends itself perfectly to a filmable spectacle. Indeed, even symbolises the futility of the outcome. The officials are inept, as they are in all sports, and the rules of the game are never explicitly outlined. But they don't need to be. It's obvious that kills are more important than goals. Like in all action sports films, there's a healthy dose of homoeroticism. Sweaty locker room camaraderie is in abundance, and the relationship between Jonathan and his teammate here, Moonpie, played with scene-chewing gusto by John Beck, is much more intimate than with any women in the film. Indeed, the women are completely incidental and are decorations. It tells us something about 70s sexual politics, I think, and in this future, it's certainly not a feminist future. So finally, another thing to look out for is the party scene, which is really off-the-hook weird. I was trying to think of how to describe it to you, and it's kind of as if Andy Warhol and Yoko Ono had thrown an amphetamine tasting night at the Playboy Mansion and invited Richard Nixon and the Dallas Cowboys as special guests. The DJ is a stoned Brian Eno, and then halfway through, Michael Bay turns up and starts making a 16mm student film. It's truly bizarre. The fashions are wackily 1970s, caftans and jumpsuits are en vogue, and the whole film is an incredible design which manages to look both futuristic and out of date simultaneously. The score is by Andrei Previn, but the iconic title sequence is Bach's Toccata in Fugue in D minor. I'd like to pretend that I know what that means, but I don't. It's a piece written in 1833, but sets up a futuristic tone for the film perfectly, and it ranks up with 2001's Zarathustra. Also, Rollerball is the best font in movie history. Overall, this is a fascinating look into the future, set in 2018, only 4 years from now. It's firmly rooted in the 1970s, but in many ways foresees the future of corporate power that is increasingly prescient today. And it reflects how sports and violence, in many ways, are still the opiate of the masses. Its ending leaves you questioning, but also wanting more. So, I give you Norman Jewison and James Caan and Rollerball. Enjoy.
We should make it clear. I mean, I think it's pretty clear from the introductions, but we are talking about the original Rollerball and the Thing, not the remakes,
but the remake of The Fly.
But the remake of The Fly, which I think is a very loose remake to the to the original. But yeah, we are talking about the kind of the original films in those.
Yeah.
We were going to ask, really, what we were going to talk about, what do remakes like Rollerball and The Thing generally miss in terms of in comparison to those films that they're drawn from?
Well, it seems that when and in a way, sort of remakes and reboots, a lot of them fall into this trap where actually they take out a lot of the social, political, ideological context, which makes the first film interesting.
Yeah.
And go for the action spectacle. I mean, the second, the remake of Rollerball is just not even worth, 5 minutes of your time. You go back to the original, and it's just, I mean, it's so prescient. The idea that democracy has collapsed because corporations have taken over and they make all the decisions and plan, everything about the world, and they give you entertainment, and all they ask is that you enjoy this entertainment and don't interfere with the corporate decisions that gets made. I mean, it could be a bloody documentary, that.
Yeah. And I think as well, The Thing, when you read, you read the media, you read the press, and how you are made to suspect everybody around you because of the other, not anything specific, but this sense, this unseen kind of enemy which is everywhere, and that has infiltrated everywhere, and you have to be suspicious and trust no one. Those are really, really direct kind of themes to today. But yeah, it's almost like they take the fantasy and ignore the sci-fi. They just want that. They want the way it looks and almost the kind of the association with the original, even though there's not really any care about what makes those originals really interesting examples of the genre, and films that are still relevant 30, 40 years after they were made. But it's because they are made, with a direct sort of line to the era that they're made in, and also kind of the fundamental questions of society and culture and the way we operate as human beings. So.
I mean, and again, it's amazing how, I mean, I think the 70s sci-fi era is the strongest era for sci-fi, particularly because they are making these political comments.
Well, one of the films we saw, was at the Silent Running at Eden, which is again a really interesting film, particularly sort of 40 years later in terms of ecology and the environment and things like that.
No, absolutely. And it's amazing how much these films have kind of gotten it right in many ways, but we seem to have come to accept that world that we live in, which 30, 40 years ago seems absolutely scary. I mean, the idea of a global spectator sport. I mean, just look at the corruption in that has just come out this week in world football. But the idea that here is one globalized sport that is used to distract the masses. So you think about how much people, how much time and energy and thought and money people invest in simply following a team that they feel some kind of allegiance with, and how much does that actually stop them from thinking about the realities of their day-to-day life, or keep them distracted from that in a way.
And I think that we have that conversation a lot with students just on a film basis. How much are they being distracted by spectacle and almost kind of thinking they don't have to be critical because they're just being blown away by this surface, by this and this distraction of what's really going on at the heart of things.
And the other thing is what seems to be interesting as well is that a lot of films they even do have a kind of political underpinning or a political subtext to it. It's used to simply reproduce or recycle the simple hero narrative stories. The idea of usually the lone man coming up and saving a people, but it's done in such a superficial kind of way that it simply doesn't have a sort of political resonance in the way that the 70s films do.
And I think also a lot of this stuff is we can look back at that stuff and see white men in those roles and not feel judgmental of it. Something like Interstellar presents this narrative of white America will save the day, and we just don't buy that politically anymore because of because of the era that we live in. So on the most basic level of casting and kind of how the audience sees the film, it's not engaged with any of the pertinent questions about real life as it's lived. So you can't get past the fact that it's just not engaged with anything relevant to how we live now.
But it's also, I think, perhaps this idea that the notion of neoliberal politics, the idea of the rich versus the poor, which does underpin a lot of sci-fi. Even when the poor win in a sci-fi movie, it becomes spectacle because you know that the poor don't win in real life. There has to be some more development or much more nuance in terms of the presentation of an ideological situation in contemporary sci-fi, I think.
Definitely. We watched Brazil as well, didn't we, last year, which is a great example of that. And the ending of that is exactly what you're talking about. This almost fantasy ending, because the reality is that the things don't change. The system cannot be changed unless it's by this gallant kind of almost sort of supernatural event, which kind of succeeds. But it's interesting. Like Under the Skin is a great example of a film that is pigeonholed immediately because of its interest in ideas, and her as well. Her as it's an ideas film.
So underrated. It's been so forgotten, that film. It's as good as anything in terms of looking a little way into the future, maybe 10, 15, 20 years, maybe a little bit further into the future, and sort of. But it's so recognizable in the way that we interact with computer systems today. We're not far away from what they're calling now the Internet of Things, where everything is going to be hooked up and we're going to be networked all the time. I mean, I practically feel like that as it is. So it's such a prescient film. And then and of course, very recently there was a great film, Ex Machina,
which I haven't seen yet. So
oh God, you've got to. We'll have to have a screening of that for sure.
Yeah.
That is really, really interesting. And again, that brings back a lot of these issues about the relationship between men and women, and the sort of construction of the robot in the mind's eye of the male protagonist, but really sort of playing around with those themes, I think, which is really, really interesting.
Yeah, so we'll probably come back to that on a third episode, maybe, if we're.
Yeah, sounds good to me.
Yeah. So that pretty much brings us, I think, to the close. It's a good spot to end on for our first in a two-part sci-fi special. And what's going to be coming up on part 2 of our sci-fi special?
Well, part 2 is going to be a really interesting discussion around one film. And the film that me and Neil are going to watch is going to be, because all the students have gone back home or gone off.
A lot of them are gutted because
they love us. Not going to hear.
They love us talking about this film.
Yeah, we're gonna screen Pacific Rim, and we're gonna rewatch that again together. And the reason we're going to do that with this specific film is this is one film that me and Neil have fundamentally disagreed on, to the point of argument and actual ridicule in some regards. Neil is a champion of this film. I am not a champion of this film. I've only seen it once, and again, I saw it in a really crappy cinema, and I wasn't in the greatest of moods. And I'd gone to see something else, and I couldn't get in, so I was kind of in a bad mood that I had to go and see this film anyway. And there's lots of issues around it why I don't think it's a good film. But there's lots of reasons why you do think it's a good film.
Yeah. So I think we're hoping that we will just sort of find ourselves closer to each other's point of view. I think. I mean, I know it's problematic, and I know there are major problems with it. But it was one of those things. I went to the cinema, and I thought, I need to see giant robots, beating up giant monsters. I was just in that I was in that mood where that's what I needed to see. So I went to cinema, and I was really kind of like, wow, I had so much fun. I hadn't had that much fun at the cinema in ages, and actually, it's the only film in recent years I've gone back to see at the cinema. I literally went back the next week to watch it again because I was like, that was a lot of fun, and I had as much fun the second time round, and I've seen it several times since, and it's a film I go to. So.
And I had this reaction, which this is just another example of me being bashed over the head with absolute nonsense and then being told by critics and by friends that there was something significant within
within this nonsense.
Yeah, yeah.
And that made me even more kind of, want to reject it in that sense. But like I said, I think we're going to try and argue it out, but then come to some kind of consensus in terms of what this film actually means. And this might be a little bit more of an X-rated episode. So,
yeah, I think there's going to be shouting.
Flag that beforehand. But we've also got some interesting news about the cinematologists in the summer and a special event at Port Elliot Festival.
Yeah, so it's confirmed that we are going to be at the Port Elliot Festival.
Well, you are. I'm going to be in Croatia.
You're going to be in Croatia. I will be at presenting the cinematologists at the Port Elliot Festival. And we are screening John Borman's Point Blank with Lee Marvin.
Have you got a substitute for me?
We have. The Bresson lover himself, Mark Jenkin, one of our colleagues here, who's also presenting his new film at Port Elliot. Not the whole thing, but kind of talking about the making of it and showing some clips from it. So he's going to be there and he's going to join me to talk about Point Blank, which is a film that he really likes as well. And
you're a big fan of that.
Yeah, I mean, it's
really to 70s. Kind of classic,
yeah, it's from 67.
Sorry, 67.
So it's the same year as Bonnie and Clyde, The Samurai, Suzuki's Branded to Kill, Petrie's We Still Kill the Old Way. It's really it is one of my favourite films. I don't think there's many better crime films. Lee Marvin is spectacular in this film, and it's beautifully shot, cool, and just hard, tough movie. So I'm really looking forward to presenting that because it's one of my faves. And also at the festival, we're going to be talking to some of the other people at the festival who've got film-related work, be it books or new films. So we're going to be picking up some interviews for a kind of Port Elliot special to release over the summer.
Yeah, well, that sounds absolutely fantastic. I'm gutted. I'm not going to be there, but
it won't be the same. But maybe we won't be talking after Pacific Rooms.
Yeah, that's it. We've probably had enough of each other by that point. Everybody needs a holiday.
So this episode of The Cinematologist has been produced by Dario. The title music is by Nine Inch Nails, and the segue music is by Moby. You can find information on screenings, music licenses, and archived episodes at cinematologist.com. Download the podcast on iTunes, and if you have the time, please give us a quick review, 4 or 5 stars if possible, and if you think that we deserve it. Follow us on Twitter at Cinematologists and on Facebook at facebook.com/cinematologists. Until next time, this has been the Cinematologist Podcast. Thanks for listening.